I'm here with Democrat Andy Schmookler, who hopes to take on Republican incumbent Bob Goodlatte in the upcoming congressional race. How are you today, Andy?
I'm okay.
Great. Just a few quick questions to get to know you first. What is your background education-wise?
I have a PhD, and before I got the PhD, I have a bachelor's degree. How much do you want to know about either of those things?
Well, I'm mostly interested in learning how your education and what you've done so far in life brought you to wanting to run for.
Since I was 15, I've worked to develop myself into somebody who can see the big picture, how the pieces fit together, what the patterns are. That's what got me into this race, because I've seen some patterns and forces operating in American society because of the background I've got that I believe are really important for us Americans to pay attention to. And they are at the root of my reason for running. There's something going on, it can be called the political dynamic in American society today, that I see as very destructive. And I don't believe that if I'd spent my life differently, I would perceive it as I do.
Now, I guess since you're talking about a destructive political dynamic, let's talk about the elephant in the room. You have this great pin on today.
Says, yes. A society that has a problem of the elephant in the room has two problems. One is the elephant, which is something that is wrong with the system. And the other is the fact that the other components of the system are pretending it's not there. We Americans have that problem. The elephant in the room is the destructive force that's taken over today's Republican Party. And the problem of the elephant in the room also is the failure of the Democratic Party, as well as the media, to confront and help the American people see what's going on. As a result, the American political system and everything that it touches is being damaged.
So what needs to be done to fix that?
My belief is that in a society like ours, in which the power of the government is given only with the consent of the governed, that a force like has taken over the American right can only gain power by deceiving people about its true nature and what it's actually doing with its power. So what I think we should be about is helping our countrymen to see what's going on, to see that force for what it is. And they will never knowingly give power to a force that's operating as destructively as this, with its dishonesty, with its dividing groups of Americans continually against each other, rather than bringing us together to achieve our common purposes based on our shared values. The way that it's taking power and wealth away from average Americans to give to the people who already have the most power and wealth. This is not the American way, and I think that the more that we can help Americans to see that what's going on now represents a betrayal of our traditional ideals for our democracy, the less that power, that force will be able to wreak its damage on America. America needs a good conservative party, but we need to be able to have that party again. We have to make that force pay a price for behaving destructively in our political system.
Now, I know that you've talked about the idea that liberalism has some moral blind spots. I was wondering if you could elaborate on that a little bit.
Well, I think I've been talking here about this destructive force, and one of the so people will say, "Oh, he's just a Democrat, bad-mouthing the Republicans." But no, I think both parties have shown serious defects. And the serious defect on the part of the Democrats, our founders would have expected the other major faction in the political system to act as a guardian against something like this. But the Democrats have been weak or ineffectual or unwilling, and for whatever other reason, to confront that. I actually believe, in terms of spiritual blind spots, that in American liberalism today, there's come to be a reluctance to see that sometimes there are forces that are not to be built bridges to. Sometimes you actually have to do battle against things. That there is such a thing as forces that are life-enhancing and some that are simply plain dark and destructive. Liberalism has become perhaps disabled by some of its, in conjunction with some of its own values. The value of tolerance is a great thing, but there are some things that are not to be tolerated. The value of seeking to have reconciliation and to make common cause and bipartisanship, I think that's a good thing. But you have to know that there are some situations where you're dealing with people in good faith and you build bridges with them and you act with them to try to come to some higher wisdom than each side has only a piece of the truth. But sometimes you're up against something which is acting in bad faith. And when that's the case, it requires a different solution. It requires that you confront that power and that you be willing to fight that power, that you take the risk. And I think that the Democrats also, in addition to the spiritual weakness, have something of the syndrome of the people who've been bullied, that they are unwilling to stand up because they're afraid what's going to happen if they do stand up and fight. There's no reason, I think, to have that fear. I think that if we're armed with the moral truth about the situation, nothing bad is going to happen to us. And if we fail to fight the fight that needs to be fought, that's the thing to be afraid of.
All right, well, let's switch gears a little and talk about a few issues that are important to Lynch.
I know I've been talking at an abstract level, and this is...
Well, that's all right.
The abstract has got to do with my background about seeing the patterns.
Yeah.
But the pattern only emerges if you've also studied the particular pieces. So let's go for it.
Well, one thing that has become a very localized issue is this effort to repeal the Health Care Act, which I know Dean Staver over at Liberty University is involved in one case that's reaching the higher courts now, as is Attorney General Cuccinelli. I was wondering where you stand on health care and what you think the strengths or weaknesses of the bill or the act are now that it's law.
Okay. Well, let me start just with a transition to make a connection with what I was saying before. It should be noted that the Republican challenges against its constitutionality, I believe that they are misguided challenges in terms of the Constitution, but the courts will sort that out, and given the layout, Anthony Kennedy's vote on the Supreme Court will officially decide whether it's constitutional or unconstitutional to have an individual mandate. But the thing I wanted to point out is this individual mandate idea was a Republican idea. It originated out of the Republican Senate when the Clinton administration tried to reform health care, and the Republicans put forward an alternative approach which involved this individual mandate in order to maintain the private sector, private corporations' central involvement in our healthcare system. So what that illustrates is the problem of dishonesty and hypocrisy. That some of the same people who advanced this as an idea now say, oh, it's patently unconstitutional. So we need a politics in which people speak in a spirit of truthfulness. And if they speak one way when it serves their interests and say the opposite thing when it doesn't, then you've got something other than the spirit of truthfulness. Now, going back to the issue of health care per se, some things should be put on the table that are facts, which is, for example, we pay twice as much as the people of any other advanced democracy for our health care. And our health care as a system for delivering care to the population works less well than many of the other societies that have different approaches. And so we're paying twice as much for something that works less well. That by itself tells you that we need to do something about it. And the fact is that when Clinton tried to change it, the Republicans blocked it. 20 years later, here we are, almost 20 years, and we're paying hugely amount more. It is an injury to not only to the federal government, and which pays for the medical care of senior citizens, but also for private businesses and also for families. We're the only advanced society where people are only millions and millions of people are only a medical emergency away from personal bankruptcy. We're the only society in which 45,000 people a year, according to a Harvard Medical School study, die every year in America because of a lack of health care coverage. So we have a problem. The Republicans have tried to block doing anything about it. When they controlled the government, they did nothing about it. So there should be no question but that we have to reform the system as it is. And there should be no question but that the Democratic Party has at least made an effort to reform it, and the Republicans have when they had the control, they did nothing, and when the other party had control, they did everything they could to block it. That is not a creditable record. Now, if you ask me, is this particular solution that was passed in 2010, is this the ideal solution? No. I believe that you could say that it was a step in the right direction. It provided a foundation on which subsequent Congresses could build into a truly good system. But it was the best that the Democrats were able to achieve, given some of the weak ways in which they are able to do their messaging, which brings back to the weakness that the Democrats have shown. It was an achievement. It was a positive step, but it was not the best possible step. It's not what we would have stopped with, and I hope that it doesn't get repealed. And if it does get repealed, I hope that we will come up with a solution which, from the point of view of conservatives, is further government involvement, but which has a much greater capacity to solve our basic health care problem, which is we have runaway costs, a very inefficient system, and we need to resolve that into a more efficient system. And I believe that the best way to do that is to have a single payer that anybody can buy in, that's not subsidized by the government, but that is organized by the government. And if that is in competition with private health care plans, that's fine. If the private health care plans can deliver better for less, that's good. People always complain about the post office and say, if the government-run things are bad. Well, if government can't run a good thing, then the private sector should be able to out-compete it. But if they can't outcompete it, at least the Medicare system is able to deliver health care with something like 2% overhead, whereas right now the private health care system with the private insurance companies has like 30% overhead. That kind of inefficiency is bankrupting the country, and if this particular solution is defeated, then we can go in that direction.
Great. Well,
is that more than you wanted to hear?
No, it's very comprehensive. I think that often we don't hear the whole issue. Many people just stick to rhetoric. So.
Well, there's a lot more that could be said, but some of the people who are healthcare experts. But I'm not a healthcare expert, but I've been reading about it pretty intensively during that whole year and a half when this issue was front and center. And these are the conclusions I've reached. Great.
Well, another issue that's very important to a lot of people that live in Lynchburg is energy, specifically nuclear power. We have a couple large vendors that are based in Lynchburg, including Areva and Babcock and Wilcox. And I was wondering where you stand on nuclear power as far as energy is concerned.
Well, nuclear power has the advantage that it doesn't contribute to climate change. And climate change is a huge issue, which, again, dishonesty is preventing us Americans from talking about in a realistic way. 97% of the top climate scientists are in accord, and the whole Republican Party essentially rejects the conclusions of that huge consensus. Not everybody disagrees, who knows about the field disagrees with the Republican denialism. But 97% is a huge degree of scientific consensus. So nuclear power has the advantage that it doesn't contribute to the problem of climate change. But it also has some disadvantages, and as far as I know, there has not been a solution to the problem of safe ways of having nuclear power, as we've seen in Japan recently, and safe ways of storing the waste from nuclear power. I understand that there are some other forms of nuclear power that could be developed. I'm not an expert in this, but using thorium instead of uranium. I do believe we need to invest in making a transition away from fossil fuels because we're going to run out of oil, for one thing. Even if you don't buy the climate change idea, there are a lot of people in the field of the geological field that say that we are going to run out of extractable fossil fuels. So we need to do something about our reliance on fossil fuels and renewable kinds of energy including possibly some kind of nuclear energy. But I'm afraid about the problem of not being able to store things that we have to store safely for 10,000 years.
Moving on to another hot topic, of course, unemployment. Do you have any ideas for getting people back in jobs, or where the jobs would come from? Or
well, the question of jobs was supposedly front and center in the 2010 elections, but nothing has been done about jobs in all this while. We've got budget cutting in ways which I think hurt the most vulnerable people and hurt the American people generally, and hurt, indeed, are not even good for solving the problem of the deficit, because the cuts that the Republicans extorted from the Democrats to avoid a government shutdown, according to the Congressional Budget Office, those cuts will result in the loss of 400,000 additional jobs. One thing that should be understood, spending is not out of control in America. That's not the reason for the deficits. Spending has been up a bit because whenever you have an economic slowdown, the government has to spend more for unemployment compensation to help families have food on their table and like that. But the main thing is that with all these people unemployed, revenues have declined. Revenues are at a lower level now than they've been for 60 years as a percentage of GDP because so many people are unemployed. The role of the government should be to lean against the business cycle. The role of the government should be to spend more and tax less during bad times, to spend less and tax more during the boom times. Instead, the Republican administration from 2001 till the beginning of this recession doubled the national debt, though they inherited surpluses that we finally got to. There's a story in the Bible that tells you how governments should act. It's got to do with when Joseph is called upon to interpret the dreams of Pharaoh, who has a dream about 7 fat cattle, and then followed by 7 lean ones who devour the 7 fat ones. And then there's 7 full grain plants, followed by 7 withered grain plants that devour the fat ones. And the Pharaoh asks, what does the dream mean? And Joseph answers, there's going to be 7 fat years, followed by 7 lean years. And during the 7 years of rich harvest, we should take a portion of the harvest and store it in a granary. And then when the 7 lean years come, instead of having people dying of famine, we'll empty the granaries gradually to feed the people. That's what the federal government should do with our business cycle. That's the insight that's called Keynesian economics. It's not just about running deficits, it's about leaning in the opposite direction. It runs deficits at times like this that are hard, where people are unemployed, but it builds up surpluses when the times are good. The problem isn't that we're spending too much now, the problem is that we doubled the debt during the years we should have been filling the granaries. So what the government should be doing now is putting people to work the way Franklin Roosevelt put people to work. Nobody benefits from millions of people sitting at home or pounding the pavement in a vain attempt to find jobs that aren't there. There's not the federal government spending doesn't take money out of the private sphere. Businesses got plenty of money now. They're sitting on $2.5 trillion. The reason they're not spending the money is because there's no demand. And the reason there's not any demand is because people are out of work, or they're afraid of not having work. And the solution is to do what the Obama administration tried to do, the Republicans tried to stop, even though they knew, Bush had just a year before sent out tax cuts. They knew that this kind of thing is called for in lean times, but you have to spend the money intelligently. So the Republicans, when they tell you to give more money to the rich with extension of the tax cuts for the richest, the millionaires and billionaires, you can get 5 or 6 times more boost to the economy by giving the money to things where the money actually gets spent, as opposed to what happens when you give a tax cut to the very richest people. And one of the ways of getting it spent is to build up our infrastructure. America's infrastructure is in decline. It was several years ago that the American Society of Engineers, or some such national blue ribbon group, gave us a D a grade of D for our infrastructure. We need work done. This is an opportunity where the federal government can repair our roads and bridges and do other things like the Civilian Conservation Corps did without costing us anything, and in fact leading to a recovery in the economic system. And as the revenues increase with people at work, then the deficit will disappear. Instead of making these cruel cuts that are hurting people, that are diminishing government where it's already lean, and having the effect of leading to more people being out of work, which leads in turn to still more deficits in the future. This is folly, it is insanity, and it is wickedness. And I am embarrassed that our country is not dealing with its economic crisis more boldly than it is. I would say that Obama's only fault has been that he didn't make a pitch for the kind of stimulus that we actually needed. He was more cautious. The right wing always talks about him being overreaching. His faults are the opposite. He has got real faults. They are the opposite of what the Republicans are always saying. He didn't overreach. The best economists I know of, like Paul Krugman and Dean Baker, said we needed a stimulus that was twice as big as that. He didn't even try for it. That's the only place he would be faulting. But what he tried for, the Republicans tried to beat down anyway. So the best leadership we've got has been on the Democratic side. We need the Republicans to be constructive partners in dealing with our national problems, not just taking on positions that are calculated to get them political advantage, even if they hurt the country.
Now, just as a quick wrap-up question, do you have any hopes or goals specific to the 6th that if you get elected, you'd like to accomplish?
Well, I think most of the problems that our people in the 6th district face are problems like the ones we're talking about, which are at a national level. There is the problem, in terms of just a local kind of a problem, there is the problem of fracking, which has got to do with ways of getting fuel out of shale. And the record of fracking, both politically, is disreputable. It has been specifically excluded from being able to have the federal government do anything to protect the environment. So the people who did that must have understood what has become increasingly evident with each passing year, which is that fracking is extremely environmentally destructive. So they go out and they make these big energy companies make misrepresentations to American families that are in somewhat, are eager to make ends meet, and they make misrepresentations and they induce them to sell their birthright for a mess of pottage. But what's the advantage of a few $1,000s right now if it means that the generations to come are going to have contaminated groundwater? So this is one of those bargains with the devil that we shouldn't be making. And Bob Goodlatte, who is my opponent as I seek this nomination at least, he has been all for the fracking, which I believe to be at the expense of the well-being of this area, to the west of us in this district where the shale is located, the Marcellus Shale. And it is in the interests only of the energy companies that have a record of raping the land and moving on when things have been spoiled. Their profits they take away, and the people who live in the area are left with the residue. I don't think that that's a creditable position. I don't think that's in service to the well-being of the people, and I don't think it's true conservatism. We don't have a true conservative party in here that is willing to ignore climate change, that's willing to plunder the land, that's willing to double the national debt when they've got the chance, that is not willing to work in a spirit of genuine national interest, that puts up a banner that says country first, but then they making the president fail their number one priority in a way where the president's failure, whatever you may think of him, when we only have one president, if you make him fail at a time of national crisis, you're hurting the country. Country first, from that kind of behavior from them, it just shows you we've got hypocrisy, we've got dishonesty, we have a lack of constructive spirit. It's not the American way. True conservatives should not tolerate that from the Republican Party. If they don't want to vote for me because they can't vote for a Democrat or anybody who's got a D next to their name, they should at least tell their leaders, clean up your act. We need We need you to be acting for the good of this country. That's what conservatism is. That's what real patriotism is.
Well, thank you so much for being here with us today, Andy. We wish you the best of luck in your campaign.
Thank you, Emily. I've enjoyed talking with you. I appreciate you threw me those pitches and allowed me to get as much wood on the ball as I could.
That's right. Take care.
Bye-bye.